Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Behruz Qamari Tabrizi. I'm the director of Sharmin and Bijan Mossavar-Rahmani Center for Iran and Persian Gulf Studies. We always think of Iran and Persian Gulf Studies in a very broad transnational sense, and today's lecture is in sort of an instance of that way of thinking that goes beyond geographical boundaries and think about communities in different places and displaced communities in a sense. Our speaker today, Professor Sahar Sadeghi, is Associate Professor of Sociology at Muhlenberg College in Philadelphia. It's sort of in the neighborhood. Professor Sadeghi is a graduate of the STEAM program, sociology program at Temple University. She received her PhD in 2014, and her work generally in sociological terms deals with questions of inequality and power and American ethnic diversity and transnational migrant communities. Today, she is going to talk about her amazing book, just came out hot out of the oven, so to speak. It's not that hot, I can hold it, you know. and this is one of the sort of emerging fields of inquiry, both in Iranian studies as well as American ethnic studies. And this book is really a wonderful example of rethinking American and, in this case, German societies and the way they are shaped and conditioned by rising different communities of immigrants, in this case Iranians. Without further ado, I would like to welcome Professor Sadeghi, and please help me to welcome.
Good afternoon, everybody. Check, check. Can you hear me? My voice does carry, so I'm not going to lean into the mic. I'm already pretty loud, so I've been told. Thank you so much for spending the afternoon with me. It is nice weather, right? A little humid, but nice. I think we're almost hitting 60. A little interesting for the end of February on the East Coast, but you know, I won't complain. Thank you so much for having me. It is actually my first time at Princeton University, and I got a really nice tour this morning. I know a lot more about the history of this institution, so I'm really, given that I love history, that was really nice. Thank you so much, and I'm so glad that you are here with me. What I want to do today is I am really going to try to stick to 40 minutes. It is extremely hard, particularly because this work is comparative, it is qualitative, and I have to kind of set the scene for us to better understand the data and what I found when I spoke to Iranians. So please stay with me as much as you can until I lay the foundation. Of course, I want to thank you all, and as well as the Sharmin Bijan Mossavar-Rahmani Center for Iran and Persian Gulf Studies for having me. I'm quite excited to be here and share this work with you. I want to tell you, I've had a few already practice runs giving this talk, so I've tried to get the presentation not just down to the kernel of the story, but also so I can present the data in a way that's layered and structured. So if I may, I'm going to set the foundation before we get into what I found, okay? And what that means is I'm going to set a little bit of a historical context and go through the layers of the story with you, because I'm kind of telling a story, right, about the everyday experiences of first and second generation Iranians living in the United States and Germany. This work that went into the book took about 10 years of my life. It was mostly through ethnographic fieldwork and qualitative in-depth interviews. They were done in 2 stages, in 2 waves. And this waves, or when we follow up, we call that longitudinal research. And longitudinal research and qualitative work is quite rare. And that's because you're going back and trying to speak to the same people you spoke to before, which is much harder to do than statistical data sets. So when we look at longitudinal data, we usually get that out of quantitative studies. So for a qualitative research project to try to employ longitudinal work not only takes time, but you know, you have to be patient. Luckily, I'm patient. Okay. The initial first wave of the data, which amounted to 88 in-depth interviews, 88, 44 in Germany and 44 in the United States, was done between 2010 and 2011, okay? And then in 2016, and the summers of 2017, 18, 19, I returned to the first site. I returned to Germany, Hamburg, and I returned to Northern and Southern California. And there I conduct about 24 interviews. So the data in the book is about 64 interviews out of my dissertation work and 24 follow-up interviews, okay? So 12 in the US and 12 in Hamburg. So again, the data presented in the book is qualitative in nature, it is comparative, and it is longitudinal. So if I may, I want to give you, bless you, I want to give you 4 aspects of my work and what it deals with, and then I will walk you through. So the first aspect of my work is looking at how global political context, how global political climate, political events, global policies impact processes of racialization, politicization, okay? So racial othering. The second aspect of my work is interested in the national climate, how the national context, how national policies impact processes of racialization. The third, I'm interested in what does experiences of racial othering, experiences of racialization, marginality, experiencing discrimination, how that's impacted Iranians. And what I found is it impacts Iranians to a state of conditional belonging, which we can talk about later, and I'll talk about. It's a sense of conditional belonging. You belong, but your belonging is not unqualified. It is not unconditional. There's a number of things you have to meet to belong. So it's conditional. And a lot of it is conditioned upon what's happening in the national and the global context, okay? And the fourth aspect of my work is if Iranians are racialized, which I found they are, and they have experiences of marginality and discrimination, how do they cope? How do they navigate? How do they respond to that? And what I found is that they employ, okay, different methods in different countries. The methods they're able to employ in Germany is something I call cultural malleability, and what they employ in the United States is racial flexibility. And the reason they employ these different things is because they're living in different nations that do race differently, that have similar but different hierarchies in place. Okay? So then, as sociologists and many other social scientists, whenever you start a research project, they want to ask you why. Why are you studying these people? What is significant? Something that I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing. I'll leave the judgment to you. We are fascinated and a little obsessed with gaps in knowledge. Well, why these people? What's so important about these people? Like this novel idea. I kind of push back sometimes against that, but what is the gap in literature or the gap in research for Iranians? It's quite profound because it is still an emerging field. Iranian diasporic studies is an emerging field. A lot of the first wave research that was done on Iranians, particularly in the United States, was really about assimilation, integration, entrepreneurship, and in many ways trying to prove that Iranians have made some sort of economic successes, that they're professionally mobile, they're entrepreneurs, so on and so forth. And by the way, there's nothing wrong with this research. It's just, it sets a foundation. But there's a lot of things we don't know. There's a lot of things we don't know. So I hope that this book is kind of adding to that existing literature of the things that we don't know. So again, why Iranians, right? Why Iranians? What can the case, right, of Iranians tell us about processes of race, racialization, belonging? Well, the reason for Iranians, and just kind of bear with me as I tease this apart, is that, well, in the United States and Germany, Iranians are seen as immigrants who have attained high SES. In SES, in SOC, that means socioeconomic status, that they have educational attainment. And when we say educational attainment, we're talking about usually bachelor's and above, college educated. The other thing, a professional advancement, they have mobility. And when we say mobility, we're talking about economic mobility, okay? Like being able to hit the markers of middle class and living a middle class lifestyle. These are the things that in social, when we say professional advancement, mobility, they stand for all these other things. The other thing about Iranians is that compared to, compared to the stereotype of other Middle Easterners and other groups that come from Muslim majority nations, one assumption that is seen is that Iranians are secular. They're secular, they're not too religious, and by too religious, please know I mean not too Muslim. Okay, not too Muslim. That's kind of the marker of not being too religious in this case means that they don't maybe portray it or their height are visible. And the other one, of course, their social and cultural integration. However, there's a conundrum for Iranians, right? So in the sense of being secular, culturally integrated, having high SES, those are all the markers that we find for immigrant success in Western nations, particularly in the US and Canada. But there's one thing about Iranians. They are migrating from a politicized homeland, a homeland that's been politicized for 44 years. And that is the caveat. So that's why the case of Iranians. So on the one hand, you're seen as, quote unquote, a model minority, which is another concept that comes out of the sociological work, a model minority, right? But you are from a politicized homeland. Now, why the comparative? Why compare Iranians? If they have those things in common, which I pointed to bullet number 1 and 2, why them? Well, because they're also migrating into nations that have very unique racial histories, right? So one, the reason why I chose Germany is, well, I have lived experience in Germany. I was a child in Germany, so I know a little bit about the German context of living there, my lived experiences, the lived experiences of my parents. And the other one is that outside of the United States and Canada, Germany still is the third country of prime destination for Iranians to migrate into, which means that Germany, similar to the United States, has a sizable Iranian community, and of course, communities, and continues to be a prime destination of migration. So, one, Iranians live in these places, but these places, these nations, are also racial states. What that means is they have a history of race making. They have a history of colonialism. They have a history of settler colonialism, of Nazism, of fascism, and so on and so forth. So they have a similar history, but they still do race differently. So then the racial othering that happens, the narratives that these nations tell about who they are, and their history of immigration or lack of immigration is quite different. So that means Iranians, similar to other people who come into these nations, are racialized differently. They're racialized, but it's done differently. The other aspects, I keep telling you there's all these other aspects, so I apologize of all the layers. The last layer is after the Iranian Revolution and the hostage crisis, the United States and the German state had very different relationships with Iran since then. And what I mean by that is the severing of diplomatic ties between the United States and Iran. And when we say diplomatic ties, what we're talking about is embassies. Whether there are any Iranian embassies in the United States, there are none. Whether there are any American embassies in Iran, there is none. If you want to take a flight to Iran from the United States, you can't take a direct flight. Business relations, all these things were pretty much severed after the Iranian Revolution. But these relationships did not sever with Germany. Germany still has embassies in Iranian embassies in Germany, I think about 3 maybe. There are still German embassies and direct flights still happen. So the Iranian Revolution and the hostage crisis did not impact the German state in the same way as the United States. So that also means that Iranians are received and treated differently, because that lens of global politics of being Iranian, of being stigmatized because you're Iranian, does not exist in Germany in the same way. Okay? So now, so I gave you what the research was about, kind of what the caveats of why Iranians, why the comparative case. So if I may, I want to now tease it apart. I want to take you through the US, I want to take you through Germany, and then we'll come back and talk a little bit about their experiences and so on and so forth. So when Iranians, and by the way, a lot of things I say Iranians also relate to other migrants. So it's not like Iranians are a special case here, but I'm talking about Iranians. So I say when Iranians are migrating to nations, that means all immigrants, all migrants, whenever they migrate into a new nation, they're also migrating into a place with a very specific history, with a very specific stratification system in place. So Iranians are migrating then to the US and to Germany, and these places are racialized places. They have a history. So that means that they have to find their place in a larger hierarchy, okay? Now, the narratives also differ. So in the United States, as you know, the United States continues to pride itself as a nation of immigrants, a place where all people, regardless of their religion, regardless of their ethnic, cultural, national background, can one day become Americans, right? So despite there being a history of enslavement, of settler colonialism, and a deep history of anti-immigrant movements and policy in the United States, this race-based dimension of citizenship, of immigration, that race went into state making, are much more hidden in the United States than in Germany. So that creates this illusion of inclusivity and equality when migrants come in. The additional caveat is that since 1914 Supreme Court case of Dow v. the United States, Iranians, by designation of Lebanese and Syrians, were racially classified as white. So now you have an immigrant group who is white on paper, racially classified as white, and the question becomes, do their lived experiences on the ground match up to that, match up to the white classification? And well, not really, not really, and we'll talk a little bit about what that is, right? So then, although Iranians have white racial classification, they told me that they're continuously, that they are persistently, right, stigmatized and politicized because of the larger, precarious, and at times hostile and precarious political relationships between the United States and Iran since the 1979 revolution. So what I found is that the racialization of Iranians, the racial marginality, the exclusion that they faced is mostly about either their homeland, the homeland of their parents, if they're second gen, and also the larger, wider political conflicts and the racial projects that exist in the Middle East, okay? And the evidence, if I may, that I found that the Iran story, the Iran issue is central, is all you have to do is look at the interviews with Iranians who were here prior to the revolution. Their narratives of being friendly foreigners, having a somewhat easier integration process, is in stark contrast with Iranians who then told me that right after the hostage crisis, things turn against them. They go from being friendly foreigners to being called Islamists, to being called hostage takers, so on and so forth. So the evidence, again, for looking at what this split is, particularly for those in the US, it emerges after the revolution and the hostage crisis. And I want to say it was after the revolution also that the experiences of Iranians living in Germany and the United States goes divergent. And what I mean by that is prior to the revolution, Iranians in Germany and the US had similar stories of settlement, of acceptance, so on and so forth, and it diverges in very particular ways after the revolution, okay? So many of my interviewees experienced these drastic shifts in the social climate. They experienced themselves becoming enemy foreigners and hostage takers, and they said it feels like it happened to them overnight. And the book is filled with these vignettes of the first gen who are here as international university students, or were here for business, and so on and so forth. They also described the sense of being watched, surveilled in public. There was a lot of resentment toward Iran and Iranians. It was palpable. Many of them were very uncertain whether they'd be deported back. I actually found among first generation marrying Americans, getting citizenship as a way not to be deported, so people having drastic measures to stay. The other thing that was constantly mentioned was the American media. The Iran story on Nightline, they called it, Hamid Nafisi calls it captivity narratives. There were over and over again, ABC, NBC, CBS had all these stories about Irans and so on and so forth. And Iranians were constantly telling me that this persistent imagery of Iranians as being hostage takers had profound consequences. They felt targeted by state surveillance, deportation, and it was really here that their interpersonal racism in their everyday lives increased. And it was not rare for actually ordinary private citizens, I call them vigilantes, ordinary Americans going up to Iranians telling them, hey, we're watching you. You're not welcome here anymore. And that was actually quite vivid, that this feelings of fear, surveillance was very profound among the first generation. So of course then, while Iranians are not representatives of the Iranian government, they are persistently racialized as hostage takers. And unfortunately, this did not stop. The next label after hostage takers was that Iranians are part of an axis of evil. And that came out of the George Bush speech at the State of the Union, that Iranians come from terrorist sponsoring places, that Iranians harbor this deep resentment towards anti-American, anti-Western sentiment. And of course, this enduring discourse wasn't just discourse, right? There was actual policies set into place that harmed Iranians, Iranian American citizens, that again had anything to do with the global political affairs. 9/11, I'm always asked, what do you think the role of 9/11 was? For me, what I found is that 9/11 and the war on terror just added another additional layer to the racialization. They were already racialized, right? It just adds another layer. And what the Trump presidency, what the Trump ban does, what the decertification of the Iran deal does, it just continues, the additional sanction just continues another wave of persistent racialization. So then I argue that it is these larger racial projects, it is this US-Iran relationship that is the central aspect, that is the central part of racialization, and it is those experiences that place Iranians outside of whiteness. It places them outside of whiteness. And this is where my term conditional belonging comes from. Good? Shall we move on? Good, thank you. I got you still. What happens in Germany? Like, what's up with Germany, right? So I gave you a little bit about the US, about immigration and the case of Iranians, but what about Germany? So Germany, similar to the United States, from like the 17th century, especially the 19th century onward, is dibbling and dabbling, deeply infusing itself with ideas of the European Enlightenment and German Romanticism as the philosophical influence of German state making. The German state regarded the nation as an extended family. And they believed that this extended family, the nation, should be comprised of people, right, that all have the same habits, the same culture, the same language. They all look the same. And that is then what will give expression to this authentic folk spirit of the German folk, the Folkgeist. And of course, similar to the United States and other Western nations, they're using, of course, the European Enlightenment to come up with theories of what? Eugenics, social Darwinism, that there's some civilizations that will die off, some will make it, right? And it's not surprising then that blood or descent becomes one of the main criteria for German state making. And this use of descent, this use of blood, that the nation should only be comprised of people that look like us, have the same ancestry, is used as a way to exclude all those racially and socially undesirable people from having the same civic, social, and political rights. And this idea of blood becomes the law in 1913 through the nationality law of the German Empire. So then the German state, of course, justifies its genocidal treatment of Jews and other socially marginalized groups by citing that there's this irrefutable racial, ethnic, religious, and cultural differences. So of course, similar to other theories of white supremacy, Nazism what requires these deep-rooted theories and these ideas of Aryan superiority, of these biological human differences that are here with us forever. So, as you know, Germany has a Holocaust, they go through World War II, and the question happens, Germany is destroyed. How will Germany come back into the international community after World War II? Well, Germany's acceptance back into the community, the international community, was based on a few stipulations. And I want to say it is those stipulations and those things that why the German state, if you think about why it allows asylum seekers to come and actually have a universal asylum policy comes from here. If you've ever heard of refugees fleeing, they never say they want to get to Greece. Anyone know where they all say they want to, no one say they're trying to get to Austria. No one I've ever heard say, hey, I want to stay here in Italy. They all say we're trying to get to Germany. And the question becomes why? Well, Germany has universal asylum policy. But I want to say the German state did not adopt a universal asylum policy from the goodness of their heart. I'm sure the goodness of the heart had something to do with it, but I can't measure that. What it was based on is that in order for something to not happen like that again, right? The atrocities of the past, Germany had to codify in their constitution. So the German Basic Law, Article 16A, was a mandate by law that Germany has to accept refugees and asylum seekers. Anyone who is persecuted based on religion, race, gender, sexuality has a right to seek asylum. It doesn't mean you get asylum, it just means there's a system in place, okay? So after World War II, Germany becomes a new Germany with a German socialism, humanitarian policies, and a mandate to accept refugees. The other aspect of Germany is after World War II, Germany is destructed. It needs to be rebuilt. So the German state actually signs a number of migrant recruitment initiatives with Italy, with Turkey, with Yugoslavia, so on and so forth, as a way to rebuild Germany after the war. So migrant workers are recruited from these nations, but there's a caveat and there's a problem here. They're not offered permanent settlement. What the German state wanted was these folks to come, help rebuild, and off you go back to your homeland. Well, that didn't really happen. Didn't happen in that way. So you had 2-3 generations of Turks living in Germany for 50, 60, whatever years without having citizenship. So even though after World War II, we see an era of German socialism, even though we see humanitarian policies, even though we see asylum, the remnants of racial nationalism are still in Germany because it has not eradicated ancestry from citizenship policy. So up until 2000, you can be a foreigner, du kannst ein Ausländer, you can be here as a foreigner, but you can't have German citizenship. That's a huge conundrum for a nation that wants to say that those remnants are of the past. So with a huge, this was a huge thing in Germany, the SPD and so on and so forth. In the year 2000, Germany officially then eliminates this descent-based, blood-based citizenship, and for the first time, those who don't have German ancestry can become German citizens, okay? But, again, conundrums, layers to the story. So in Germany, Iranians are not considered white, because white means something very different in Germany than in America. The concept of white in Germany, for example, I don't know how much of the history you know, there were groups in the United States who were previously not seen as white, Italians, Greek, as Southern Eastern Europeans. But after World War II, they become white. They became white. They whitened. In Germany, for example, if you were to ask them if someone from Portugal is white, they'll laugh at you, because in northern and southern Germany, the idea of race looks differently. So when Iranians are migrating into Germany, they're not coming in with an existing white racial classification. They're not considered white. So when I spoke to Iranians, I have this question about, and phenotype means how you look, right? How you look, your facial features, so on and so forth. When I asked Iranians, both first and second generation, whether phenotype, whether how one looked in Germany mattered, they would just laugh at first. And I think they laughed because it was such a obvious question. Of course it matters how we look. Of course it matters whether you look like a foreigner or not. So they were very, very much more clear and direct and straightforward than Iranians in the US by saying phenotype matters. We are stereotyped, perceived, and treated differently in Germany because we're Ausländer, because we're foreigners, and it matters, okay? And then, of course, the designation of being honorary white also doesn't exist. What did come up persistently and consistently, and by the way, not a surprise, I grew up in Germany, so hearing these narratives took me back to my own childhood quite a bit. They constantly offered the word Ausländer. Ausländer is the German word for foreigner. And what they were trying to tell me is that, listen, Sahar, being a foreigner is not something you can shed. It's not something after a generation or 2 generations or 3 generations, all of a sudden, voila, you're no longer seen as a foreigner. It's almost like something that stays with you. The other one that again, not surprised, they mentioned was a derogatory term. Schwarzkopf, by the way, the literal translation means dark-haired, having dark hair, but it's not just about having dark hair. It's about having darker features, right? Features that don't get you close to that Aryan whiteness. And when Germans, by the way, talk about phenotypic features, it's a little different than the United States, maybe in this time that we're in, to where they're talking about really light skin, blue eyes, and blonde hair. So that is a little bit different of whiteness, where here you could be maybe Italian, people could say, oh, you're still white. Very, very different in that way. And they constantly refer to this term as Schwarzkopf. And they constantly mention to me that it's a racial ethnic slur, and that it is something that they grew up with being, like thrown at them, that it comes up all the time, so on and so forth. So what I found, and I'm kind of speeding through, I apologize, what I found is that in Germany, the racialization and the marginality that Iranians experience is much less about the Iran-German relationship. It's less about them being Iranian. It's less about Iran and Germany, the states, having a good or not so good relationship. It was more about this general layer of anti-foreigner prejudice and racism that Germans continue to hold against non-Germans. And I want to say, Germany, unlike the United States, does not conceive of itself as a nation of immigrants. It never has. It's a nation that accepts refugees. It has never had an extensive immigration policy. So they don't also have these narratives of being colorblind, this idea of racial ethnic pluralism, or it being a so-called melting pot. Even the idea of an Iranian calling themselves Iranian Deutsch is kind of funny. They say it, that it is on paper, but it's like, I'm not Iranian Deutsch. Like, come on. Like, this hyphen that we use in the United States is just not there. And by the way, I'm not saying whether it means that much in the United States, whether it's symbolic. It's just these options just aren't available to Iranians in Germany. The other one, if I may, what was really interesting is them constantly telling me, you cannot actually really become German. You cannot become, and it was almost the second generation, and the second generation in the US, I didn't get this start kind of narrative. No, it's never gonna happen. The other one, if I may, and I put it up there this morning for a reason, the distinction I found, and I have a little bit of it in my book, is the second generation told me this term that I hadn't even guessed, Plastic Deutsch versus Biologic Deutsch. And what they're saying is that the Plastic Deutsch are foreigners with a German passport. The Biologic Deutsch are the real Germans. So, the Biologic Deutsch, just scary stuff coming out their mouth for a sociologist, like, woo. But that is their lived reality, and that's the kind of terms that they use. And what they really mean by that is, we will never get this mark off of this, even though citizenship. So here, and by the way, if you want to know what particular interview question this came, I asked them whether having citizenship guarantees equality. That was the question. And that question came with so many narratives, and it was always no, no. But in Germany, the no was very starker than in the United States. So yeah, the biologic plastic Deutsch, I gotta tell you, threw me a little bit. The question now comes, and I'm just gonna breeze through this, is I told y'all I went back to the field, right? I said I went back to 2016. Why did I go back? I didn't tell you yet. I went back because in 2015, Europe experienced a global migration crisis. In less than a year alone, Germany accepted 1.2 million refugees. Germany is the size of Oregon. So nobody else or their neighbors were willing to accept refugees, right? Angela Merkel even went, we're schaffen das, wir können das machen, da, 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 da. So the Germans were quite excited. By the way, that tide shifted very quickly 5 months later. But at first, Germans were there with the teddy bears, were excited to meet the refugees because Germany said, we are not that Germany no more. So, but let me tell you, I knew I had to go back because I knew there's no way that all these refugees, mostly from the Middle East and North Africa, arrived and that people would be able to deal with that well. And guess what? I was absolutely correct. I went back to the field, and the same Iranians I spoke to 5 years before who told me things are like this, but they can also, they were like, no, 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 no. It is bad, tensions are high, it's re-triggering. So a lot of them told me, we're Ausländers again. Because these are well-established Iranians in Hamburg who've been living there for 30, 40 years, and all of a sudden are reawakening to a wave of anti-Muslim, anti-refugee sentiment, and their neighbors are not talking to them anymore. Their colleagues are not. So that had a big shift on Iranians. And of course, I also returned to the field in 2017, 2018, 19, because the Trump presidency. It was very clear that this is going to have an impact on Iranians. So when I went back into the field, what I noticed that everything had intensified. The experience of racialization and marginality for Iranians in Germany had intensified, and for those in the US has intensified. Among the first generation, it was also quite interesting. A lot of them gave me very heartfelt, very sad narratives of reawakening of trauma. They said, oh my God, it feels like the hostage crisis again. So those in their 60s, in their 70s, in their 80s, who had moved in Iran at 17, at 18, who had spent like the majority of their adult life in America, as they were watching the Muslim ban and the decertification of the deal, they're starting to feel like that 18, 19-year-old again in the college dorm rooms, feeling really scared, right? And a lot of them said, what is this America that I immigrated to? Because they had no perceptions of this. So that's what I found, this reawakening, particularly among the first generation, and wondering, what is the future going to hold for Iranians in the United States, right? Where do we go? Is this it? In Germany, like I mentioned, it was the experience of heightened interpersonal exclusion. Iranians felt that they were caught up, that they were being lumped in, and the boundaries I noticed that between them versus us were much brighter in 2016 than when I was there in 2011. 5 years later, this idea of the good refugee, of the bad refugee, and that it was actually okay again to say anti-Muslim things, anti-foreigner sentiment. And for a lot of Iranians, that was jarring. That was jarring, okay? I have to go? Okay. So, whew. Okay, let me get ready for this last part. I got to do it quick. So the question here becomes, right? So what did I do? I laid out the global political for you. I laid out the national context. Now the third aspect I asked on that second slide is, how do Iranians what? Cope. How do they cope? Well, they cope differently, and the coping that they do depends on the national context. What I found is that Iranians ameliorate or try to lessen the blows of discrimination, this lack of social citizenship, by doing these various responses and maneuvers. But these coping mechanisms are really dependent on the national context. Which ones work where, and why do they work? In the United States, I found that Iranians employ racial flexibility and racial ambiguity. And what I defined it as the ability to bend and shift and shape how one is racially, ethnically perceived. And that is done through several it's conscious and it's deliberate. Okay? Cultural flexibility, it's also about signaling, but it's about expressing cultural proximity. And what I mean by that is, for example, in the United States, it comes through with adopting a Western or an Anglo name. So Muhammad is Mo. Muhammad is Mo, right? It could be sometimes calling yourself Persian instead of Iranian. And by the way, the Persian thing does not exist in Germany. You can't walk around calling yourself Persian in Germany. They're like, you mean Iran? Sometimes the Persian thing also has to do with Iranians kind of counting on Americans not knowing a good level of history and geography. They're like, Persian, Puerto Rico, Portugal. Yeah, I know where that is. So Iranians are very deliberate. That's what I'm saying, they're deliberate. Sometimes it's that. Sometimes it's also about trying to pass as another group. The favorite one among the interviews is being Italian, being perceived as Italian. And when I ask, why Italian? Because it's never Syrian. They ain't trying to be Arab. They're not trying to be Pakistani. They're never trying to pass as Bangladeshi. It's either Italian and Greek. And I asked the question, they said, because it's one that Americans like. They like the food, they like the tourism, they have good family, they're a little loud like us, but they don't have this political stigma around them. So I found that to be really interesting. And by the way, Maz Jobrani, an American-Iranian comedian, has a whole skit about doing a US census some years ago, asking Iranians to mark other and Iranian, and they're like, put down Italian. So the fact that we have that, I think, I always felt good that Maz Jobrani found similar things as I did in my work. But guess what? In Germany, changing your name does not work. Because of your phenotype. You can't just all day become she said, I can't become Frau Müller overnight. No one would believe me, right? So what happens so I said all that. So what happens in Germany, and I'll talk about what Iranians are lucky, they can play with their phenotypic features. I have to kind of go through. Cultural flexibility came up in two ways for me. The trope of being the bad and the good foreigner, and beweisen. Beweisen is a German word for proving yourself. And this really came with, when I asked him, what is a good foreigner? What is a bad foreigner? Surprise, surprise. The good foreigners are those who mingle with Germans and German organizations. They find German friends. Dating partners, I have a lot to say about that. The German dating stuff is quite interesting. They adhere to non-atheistic secularism. And they also continuously talk about that they have, from Germans and their interactions, found out those Turks are the ones we're not like, because Turks tend to be religious. They're not as educated as us. So this good and bad foreigner trope, I thought of the model minority in the United States. And these cultural appeals. For example, I always love this. So I had a young woman by the name of Lilia told me Iranians, because they're not too religious and they're not too Muslimy, and we're not at all rooted traditionally in our own practices and customs, we will eat a little pepperoni pizza. We'll drink a glass of wine. We'll smoke the occasional cigarette. And what they're saying is that when you do that in social settings with Germans, they are, oh, they're one of us, they're integrated. She looks foreign. And in this case, by the way, being a foreigner that is exotic is to the plus, because culturally, you're acting like Germans, right? So what Iranians were telling me is that we're malleable. We're flexible culturally. We can become a part of German society without being weighed down by tradition. Lastly, I know I gotta quickly go. The beweisen is always done in public. There was 2 instances of proving yourself, and these both came up in 2016 when I returned to the field. And I want to tell you, Iranians are doing more of that in public than they ever have, that beweisen. And they're always doing it in a public setting, both for themselves, but also for Germans looking, but also for the other foreigners. For example, a young woman by the name of Buya Gandom told me about her correcting foreigners on the train, telling them, don't speak loudly on the phone, don't put your foot on the seat, don't eat food. And when I asked them, why are you going up to other people on the train and why are you not minding your business? Why are you, Buya Gandom, doing that? She says, well, one is me being a foreigner, I can do that in ways Germans cannot, right? But when I asked her why, she said, one, I do not want my image to be tarnished because I see how Germans are looking, how they perceive this. I also do it because I hope that they learn. I hope that they learn that if you want to live in German society, you have to behave in this way. And at the last sentence, I thought, she says, because I do not want to get on the train tomorrow and have them say that all foreigners are rotten, that our image will be tarnished. The other one I can't go quickly into is having a dog. A dog does wonders for you in Germany. Get a dog, get a dog. That's what they say. This young woman got a dog for her mom. It went well at the park. It's something about having a dog, but it's all about cultural proximity. And when I asked her if it's about like culture, she said, oh, it's about Islam. That if you have a dog, you're one of those, even if you're Muslim, you're well integrated and you're not scared. This idea of like Muslims don't like dogs, they're dirty, all these stereotypes, right? I know a lot of Muslims who love dogs. That's not the point. The point is that these narratives exist and Iranians are trying to adjust themselves to that exist. But someone might ask me, and folks have asked me, how significant, not significant, how effective are these coping mechanisms? Whether they're effective or not, and by the way, they're not necessarily great detective because they're still being marginalized, but the point is, the effectiveness to me is the latter point. The point is that they're being done, and you only behave in a particular way. You don't respond when you feel excluded. So we should read these mechanisms that people employ as an actual indication of the racism that's on the ground, okay? Belonging. Well, unsurprisingly, I'm sure this group understands that if you are constantly either marginalized or stigmatized, it's hard to feel like you belong. And I asked Iranians about what belonging really entails, and a lot of them, it's a two-way street where it's not only that culture that's having an impact, I'm having an impact on that culture, right? So on and so forth. Lastly, I want to wrap by saying, the comparative case that I try very humbly in this book really makes it clear that in nations like the United States and Germany, where race and ancestry played a historical part, were integral, were foundational to belonging, to social membership, unconditional belonging is really unavailable to members, even if they attain the highest level of integration, SES, citizenship, so on and so forth. So this idea that the dominant narrative in Western nations tends to be that if immigrants, refugees, and ethnic minorities will be accepted once they hit these markers. And what my interviews revealed, that even those who have attained the highest professional attainment, that have wealth or have money, are still persistently marginalized. The last thing I want to kind of read, if I may, is a quote by scholars Bonilla, Silva, and Mayorga, who remind us that access to formal citizenship does not disrupt the racial order of things. For as long as racial states remain for as long as nation states remain racial states, then the judicial political categories, such as citizenship, will not confer equality. Thank you. That was a lot.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So wonderful.
I have not been in the classroom all year. That's why I have all this energy, just so you know. I have not been in the classroom.
My friend in Germany was changed his name from Hassan to Hans. It didn't help. And what's your real name?
Queen Elizabeth. I have a basic question. Because in the United States, the term race is one of phenotype, I don't understand how you can use the word racialization to discuss Iranians in the United States.
Well, because depending on what their phenotype is, they're going to be more racialized than others. So if you're darker, if you wear a hijab, if somehow you appear Muslim, whatever that means, so so again, Iranians are white on paper, but just to say, it's Middle Easterners or North Africans are classified as white, right, on paper. But does the average white American look at an Iranian and say, we are both of the same racial background, is a big question, right?
I don't know what you are until you tell me.
Let's go to fun.
So much. 3 short questions.
3 short.
Yeah,
3,
yeah.
okay.
No, the third one is very important. One question is about, in studies of immigration, there's usually the sort of comparative with other minorities. And I'm curious to hear from you about how Iranians in Germany try to move away from Palestinians and Arabs, because
Just like they do here.
yeah, so I mean, if there are sort of like mechanisms apart from, because you know it's all about the anxiety of whiteness. This whole talk, and the fact that they're near whiteness yet not white enough. So there's a whole spectrum. So I would be curious to sort of, you can pick them up. And the second question is, I know German Arab. I have friends who are German Arabs, and their parents decided, the father is Arab, the mother is German. The parents decided to give the kids the mother's last name.
German last name.
Yes.
Yeah.
And they look a bit like the mother. So basically, they're very much integrated. So they passed through phenotype and through the mother's last name.
Okay.
So I don't know if that exists in the Iranian community, but that was it was a very, very interesting move. I mean, these are people who are our age, so it's not a recent thing. So they're, and you know, I don't know how old you are, but my age. So they're definitely very old. So the third question, I want to hear more about the dating scene.
About the dating scene?
Yeah.
I'm going to go right to the dating scene. Yeah. So it was really, really interesting. And by the way, I have not engaged in an ethnographic study just of romantic partners and dating, but it is absolutely incredibly fascinating to me in Germany. I will tell you this. I spoke to Iranian women, first and second generation, who told me they deliberately only date German men. Deliberately, and it's conscious. And what they tell me is, who wants 2 foreigners in a household? Now we're both discriminated in the job market. I need one of us to be able to make some money. And what they realized is that having a German mate is not just a German mate. You get access to all the social capital, you get access to all the cultural capital, and it puts you closer than for your children. Now, for Iranian men, guess what? You think it goes the same way? Do they gain the same thing by marrying German women? No. Doesn't mean they don't do it, but I'm talking about the social currency of that dating seems to be quite more profound for Iranian women. And I never found that in my US interviews, where an Iranian woman or man will tell me, the only time the strategy I saw was getting citizenship as a way not to be deported. But in their everyday life saying, I need to make sure I date this person because we both can't be kids of immigrants. I just have never heard such a thing. And that indication of dating, and it's not just dating, it's your social circles too, who you hang out with. And they were very adamant that that matters. So I don't know if that answers your question about passing and phenotype, but I think it kind of does.
But it says something about German patriarchy.
German what?
Patriarchy.
Oh yeah, of course. Yeah. German men that I spoke to who had, Iranian men who had German partners never spoke about getting a rise in the stratification order in the same way that Iranian women told me. And it was not because they found foreign men unattractive. Let me be very clear. It was not that they found all these other men were just ugly. That's not what it was. They were just very clear about what it means to set up your life in Germany. And I'm getting all these nods, so like I clearly am onto something. Whenever people nod at me, it's like, okay, I'm kind of speaking a little bit of truth here.
A little perplexed by one thing, your insistence that Germans only get citizenship if they're German, at least in the past, because way back when, even though they don't like to talk about it very much, there were thousands of Poles who came to Germany and work in the Ruhrgebiet, and they still have Polish names and they have German citizenship.
Right.
The people who were Danish in Schleswig-Holstein were German, and the Sorbs, the Sorbians in southeast Germany in the swamps south of Berlin, they were German too, even though they spoke Sorbian. So I don't, there's got to be a little bit more. I mean, it's important, I suppose, to have Germanic blood, but they never really insisted that, despite the fact that they claimed they weren't an immigration society. And one last little point, the Quiche restaurant in Frankfurt is one of the most popular restaurants, and they refer to their food as Persische Küche, not Iranische Küche.
Sure, sure.
Okay, thank you. I look forward to reading your book. So my question has to do. So there's another book that's very popular at the moment called Caste, and the author is
what's called?
Called Caste, Caste.
C-A-S-T-E.
Right, and the author makes the point that the Nazis in Germany, some of the what is commonly known as the Holocaust laws, were really plagiarization of the Jim Crow laws in the U.S. That's that's the author's.
Oh, okay, yeah. Sorry, no doubt.
More importantly, and my question for you is, she makes the point that race, she says, is a social construct, whereas caste, you can't get away from. And some of what you described, to me sounded like caste. You're wearing a hijab for example. If you take it off, you could be misperceived as not, in this case, not Iranian. So I'd like your thoughts on that distinction between race and caste.
Well, I got to tell you, in the sociological literature, I can't. Okay, I can't. Okay, got it. Last question. Okay, last question. Sorry, thank you.
I think it's on. Thank you very much for this talk. It was very interesting and obviously has, sparked a lot of discussion, and that's a good talk. Myself being an immigrant Iranian and having raised my children here in the U.S., I don't know if you ever investigated how that first generation Iranians felt in the US or in Germany about belonging, and how long that conditional belonging, I mean, you touched upon it a little bit, but I don't know if you researched it, because the experience is that possibly because of all the cultural tensions and gives and takes and shifts, and Iranians, as you said, being shapeshifters, and I can totally identify with that, how much of that gets transmitted on to the future generations?
Okay, so the questions that I'm addressing, did I address your question up there already? Is there something else I need to address? No? The thing about German citizenship, sure, but that's not the case I looked at, the outlier or the anomalies that got access to German citizenship. But the idea that foreigners from other countries can become citizens in Germany may have been rare here and there, but it really didn't become a universal citizenship law until 2000. So that's...
Just one other point. The Iranians don't show up as gangsters in German TV shows, Turks and Serbians.
I know, yeah, of course, and Polish and all that other stuff, Yugoslavians, yeah. Oh, about caste. So I just want to say real quick, in the sociological literature on race and scholarship, we talk about the way social stratification goes from caste to race, and sometimes race operates like caste. So your question of whether Germany, what we're reading, what you're reading into, you're saying, is it really race, or is it like caste, or is it a race-like caste system?
It's so listening to your talk this morning,
Yeah,
some of the examples you were using,
yeah.
I would say, well, that's caste, that's cultural practice, that's religious practice, etc.
Except I think in a system of caste, there's no mobility whatsoever. I think in Germany,
Suggesting that also, that in Germany, you could live there for 59 years
Yeah.
and never be German.
never be German, get as close to being culturally German as possible, but the minute a conundrum happens within the nation, du bist ein Ausländer again. You're an Ausländer again, which is what the 2016 told me. Because in 2011, when I spoke to those Iranians, they felt quite integrated. Looking at the vignettes, you'll see they're like, things are pretty good here. And then 2016, when that tidal wave comes. And right now, I'm going back to Berlin next month. Guess what you think I'm gonna see for 2 months? You think it's gonna be good? It's gonna be peaches and cream when I get to Germany? As a woman who doesn't look phenotypically Aryan, you think it's gonna be fun in the next 2 months in Germany? It's a question, right? Because I'm going back I haven't been there for 8 years. And these 8 years, a lot has happened in Germany, right? So I'll tell you a little bit more about that. But I think you're absolutely correct in saying that I'm hinting that, I mean, I didn't make that argument in the book, but would I make the argument that race operates more like caste? It's less fluid, I would say that it is less fluid and more rigid. I'm willing to say that. Is that okay? Is that enough? Okay. And with regard to your question about belonging, were you saying that if the first generation has a lack of belonging, how they pass that on to their children, or?
I'm saying that.
Oh, are you asking?
My
Yeah.
own anecdotal observation, that lack of belonging continues on
Oh, of course. Of course
to
it
the next generation, where
course
they've
it
been
does.
born and raised here.
Of course
and
they do.
kind of grow up and
Right.
And they've been, and being the, whatever they call them, model immigrants or
Yeah.
the good immigrant, you do all the right things, you put them in the right schools, you do, and
Yeah.
you kind of go along.
Right.
Suddenly, you know.
Suddenly what?
And suddenly they go, I don't belong.
Okay. Okay. So if I just want to,
Decades of planning.
decades of doing. So this is why I said,
Why did I do that?
that's why I said, who knows how effective? Remember I said, how do we know? I will say this though, there was 2 things that came up that are not here, because there's only so much you can do in one book. Okay? There's only so much you can. So there's a whole bunch of other things I'm interested in. One, I want to tell you, is I was in Irvine with a man who was highly educated, had come for a PhD at USC in '72. So he'd been here a long time, has done well for himself. As I'm interviewing him about how they're raising their son, he's saying, I do not tell my son that you're white. It's a lie. He's white on paper, but in his life, it is really misdirecting them and putting them in a bubble. You know what his wife screamed from the kitchen? He is white. He is white. He is white. So I'm over here in the middle of an interview, and there is even this conflict of opinion about white. So I say, these are the conversations, but I want to tell you one thing that I'm almost certain of. I don't know to the extent, but after the Muslim ban and after Black Lives Matter, these younger folks are forever changed. So what I noticed in my follow-up when I spoke to second-gen Iranians in 2017 and 18, they had become politically aware. For something had shifted from the model mind saying, we need to be in solidarity with those other Arab kids. We need to be in solidarity with those Mexican kids fighting deportation in DACA. We need to be on the same lines with these black students. So I do think that moments of crisis have an impact of us reimagining ourselves, but also political consciousness. Meaning, if I had to do another layer of research right now to only talk to younger Iranians, the 17, 18, 15-year-olds, especially the impact of social media, I think I would find a shift from what I found. But these are all the afterthoughts that you have because, how much can you do? But I have a lot to say. I would also say that Kurdish Iranians, Iranian minorities, ethnic minorities, raise their children differently. I only spoke to Iranians who are Muslim. I didn't speak to Iranian Armenians, no Iranian Kurds. So I want to say, if you add the other layers that comprises the Iranian community, I wonder if the Kurdish Iranian parents are raising their kids differently. I will probably bet my money that they are.